what I want to critique as quickly as possible, but also just throw some other things in what would normally be perhaps a 3-hour session, is a great fashion that swept the humanitarian industry from the late 80s onwards to construe the effects of war within, if you like, mental health frameworks, especially the discourse of psychological trauma, as if this was a new discovery of the reality of war, which merited separate programs, often using millions of dollars, and with all sorts of prognostications that suddenly a whole lot of psychologists and Western mental health people employed by big agencies, and UNICEF and ECHO were suddenly in a position to promulgate and to influence policy. And although I'm not going to read, I'm just going to read this one paragraph. This was I suppose, a fairly seminal paper. It's considered in Social Science and Medicine in 1999, called A Critique of 7 Assumptions Behind Psychological Trauma Programs in War-Affected Areas, using perhaps the 2 most publicized wars of the 90s, that was Bosnia, the fallout from Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. So that's what I'm going to deal with. But this, if you like, the executive summary, I'll read it just quickly, is this. Programs costing millions of dollars to address so-called post-traumatic stress, a psychological condition, which is posited as separate from the suffering of war, separate, have been increasingly prominent in humanitarian aid operations backed by UNICEF, WHO, the EC Humanitarian Office, and many organizations, many non-government organizations, one of the most prominent being Médecins Sans Frontières. The assumptions underpinning this work, which this paper critiques with particular reference to Bosnia and Rwanda, reflect a globalization of Western cultural trends towards the medicalization of distress. In other words, grounded in secular developments in Western countries, and the rise of psychological therapies. This paper I argued that for the vast majority of survivors, post-traumatic stress was a pseudo-condition, a framing of the understandable suffering of war as a technical problem to which short-term technical solutions like counseling were applicable. These concepts aggrandize the Western agencies and their experts who from afar define the condition and bring the cure. There has been no evidence, no real evidence, that war-affected populations on their own were seeking these imported approaches, which appear to ignore their own traditions, meaning systems, and active priorities in the context, very heterogeneous context they found themselves in. So in this analysis, I came up against that question in humanitarian operations, as indeed I hear some echoes of that early this morning. Whose knowledge is privileged, and who has the power to define the problem? It became clear when I was working in Bosnia for Oxfam that the framework remains surely a social world, not the space between people's ears, where their psychology supposedly resides, invariably targeted in today's total war, and yet still embodying the collective capacity of survivor populations to mourn, endure, and rebuild. This was new. Consider this, after the Second World War, when there had been in Western Europe and Russia maybe 50 million deaths, the concentration camps, all that stuff, there was virtually no psychology, there was no psychologization of that. Those weren't seen to be things that would endure with a life of their own, independent of people who survived getting their lives together, rebuilding, getting jobs, all that sort of thing, independent of that. So things had changed. In other words, the idea that there was a sort of psychological wound that may have a life of its own was not in Western culture. And you can see that also in the attitude within Britain to peacetime disasters like the Aberfan mine disaster, when in 1966, 130 children and school teachers were swallowed up by a coal tip that collapsed on a Friday morning in school hours. No psychologization. Kids went back to school. Everyone talked about the resilience of the local community, how they actually resisted too much outside aid coming in, all that sort of thing. They were never psychologized, and there's never been any evidence that the survivors of that disaster did worse than anyone else in their lives subsequently. And of course, most of those school kids are now in their 60s. In fact, I could also argue that the Civil War in Ireland, which is, cost 4,500 lives between 69, in 30 years from 69, 4,500 lives, 100,000 wounded, generated. It's interesting, isn't it? Because this was taking place in not only a Western country, but a country known to us with an NHS. There was no evidence of increased referral to mental health services as a result of that fallout. I think that's remarkable things. It may be GPs prescribed more sleeping tablets, I don't know, but you know, where was this wound? So, Bosnia. These were the assumptions. These were the assumptions that launched a whole new program, and millions of dollars went into the program. There were 7 assumptions, and I'll just say they are briefly, just so you know how sweeping they were in their assumptions. They were things like this: that experience of war and atrocity, and there's plenty of atrocity in Bosnia, is so extreme and distinctive, i.e. different from other things, that they don't just cause suffering, because we understand what suffering is, they cause something called traumatization, moving them into the professional realm. Number 1. Number 2, that human beings all over the world, regardless of their context, regardless of their actual experiences in the war, regardless of background, culture, and the meanings that every culture has to why they're on Earth, and what is a person, yeah? That there was essentially just one stress response. At the end of the day, when you scraped off the colourful cultural garb, etc., you had only one universal stress response, which, surprise, surprise, was the one that we Western experts said that it was. That large numbers of victims, number 3, were traumatized by war and need professional help, that they wouldn't get over it by themselves, plus the normal ways in which people get over war if they survive it. That Western psychological approaches already existing in Western mental health services were immediately relevant to violent conflict anywhere in the world. And that victims would do better if they responded to those programs, if they ventilated emotionally what they'd been through, etc., than if they didn't. That there were particular vulnerable groups that had to be targeted, and in Bosnia particularly it was children and women, especially raped women, but it wasn't men. Men were a problem, though of course men took the brunt of the exposure in the Bosnian War, in the nature of things, but they weren't a targeted group, because that's a problem, isn't it? Some of them will fight, problem. So there was this sort of kitsch identification of the pure victim, if they could find them. Perhaps above all, that wars represented so what I'm quoting here is coming out of the top of the agencies. This is what the agency was saying. UNICEF was saying. UNICEF was saying about children around the world, time does not heal trauma. In other words, they won't get over it. UNICEF says, without psychological trauma programs of some kind, and I'll tell you what they did in Rwanda. And if you don't nip it in the bud, it will cause later pathologies in those societies. That is to say, mental problems, subsequent violence and wars, and indeed these experts went so far to say that what they call the cycle of violence, in countries where violence was endemic, and they might say, somewhere like Afghanistan, that there, much of this has been propagated by people who have been traumatized in early wars and saw violence as the only way to solve problems. In other words, that they were brutalized. And there's a certain language in it. Traumatization, brutalization. So from afar, a whole generation of children in Afghanistan, or in Sierra Leone, or in Rwanda, were considered brutalized with all the implications of damaged moral norms, diminished personhood. People who were less than us had been rendered up less than us, even as victims. Yet no one knew these children. From afar, a whole generation of children were their basic norms, their capacity to be ordinary members of society, to have a normal mental health, whatever that is, was being cast as pathology. And lastly, that local workers were said to be overwhelmed and themselves could be traumatized, and they needed treatment too. Things in Bosnia went so far that in fact there was an NGO in Britain that mounted trauma programs for traumatized animals, like horses in Bosnia. So clearly, psychological trauma is something that crossed species, it seems. Well, let me just show you very quickly a couple of pictures. Just mirroring this, you see here the sudden rise in academic publications, medical and social science publications and mental health publications, academic ones, in English, of interest in the foreign refugee, the foreign torture victim, the foreign rape victim. And there's this huge rise in the late 80s in papers published that had words like post-traumatic express, refugee, trauma, rape. So if you like, academic developments mirrored this sort of new interest, and this as if it was a new discovery. This was a missing facet of humanitarian assistance. Here's an example. I know it's poor, but just to give you the sense, here are three obviously rural women in Macedonia, having fled the Kosovo violence in '99, and the strapline says, women suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, they've been identified in an international newspaper as being psychologically messed up. Women suffering post-traumatic stress disorder wait for counselling in a Médecins Sans Frontières camp. And curious enough, further down, there was a complaint from the Médecins Sans Frontières psychologist, a Belgian psychologist, who said, the work is not straightforward here because all these people are denying the mental health problems we know they have. They don't want to see us. So when in doubt, the refugees were being blamed rather than the assumptions we had arrived with. I know you can't read it, but give a gift with real meaning this Christmas. This was Christian Aid. Just to say, I'll leave this one for now, but for £22, you can provide a medical kit for an HIV-positive mother in Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are other ones like this, but the first one, £10, is £10 pays for 4 counselling sessions for a child injured in the Middle East conflict. In Bosnia, any woman who came forward and said she was raped at one point was given a visa to Sweden. And I understand that on arrival, the planes landed there, and there were psychologists on the airport tarmac waiting for them, waiting for these women. In other words, rape was being essentialized as a unique category that a person was carrying, separate from where that person had lost her brother or her mother or her father, her home, whatever. All other context stripped away. This is it. And the rape counsellors were waiting for them. Yeah. A friend of mine overheard conversation between some women in a Médecins Sans Frontières rape counselling program in Sarajevo. And she was over to, what are they talking about? Well, they weren't talking about rape, they were talking about other things. They were talking about these wider questions, like the sort of, if you like, the pressure on gender relations that war throws up when the men are away. And the women, what they really want to talk about was, is the man still the boss when he's away? We're left alone now, they're fighting. Is it? Lots of things. In other words, they were talking about wider things, but they weren't. They were officially there to have rape counselling. In UNICEF established an ambitious national trauma program in Rwanda, headed by the National Trauma Center Kigali. They trained 6,000 trauma advisors, 6,000, paid for by UNICEF. Mostly teachers, health and social workers, community leaders, in so-called basic trauma alleviation methods, and claimed they'd assisted 144,000 children. This is a profoundly different sort of society, versions of why they're on Earth, what is Rwandan psychology, no such thing as trauma, no such words as these things. So we came in, we knew what they needed. And I suppose my early Zimbabwean background gives me a sense of the imperialism of this, that the wonderfulness of us Westerners. We knew what they needed, and they didn't know what they needed. They were patients in the program. Funny enough, not all Bosnians took this lying down, and when I was there one time, a Bosnian said to me, "You people, you think that we know what you know what we need. You have given us bread and counselling, and that's all. Bread and counselling. You did not give us protection. You protected the peacekeepers. You didn't protect us. 11,000 people were killed on the streets of Sarajevo alone by shelling from the hills. You gave us rape and counselling, and that's it. You didn't protect us. You've frozen the lines of ethnic cleansing, which exist to this day, and it's not clear what you brought us." When I was in Tuzla with Oxfam, the whole economy had collapsed. People were selling individual Marlboro cigarettes on the roadside for 2 Deutschmarks. At the time, there was no money in circulation, except the money that the NGOs had brought in the nature of their work. And because they offered 300 Deutschmarks a month or something like that, a lot of people who were teachers, even doctors, were leaving their posts to go and work as mechanics, drivers, interpreters for the NGOs. So what was left, if you like, of the social structure was unwittingly, of course it was accidental, being depleted further by our presence. It's not to say there weren't some good things. When I was there, I tried to handle Oxfam, and my mate Pat Bracken tried to handle Save the Children Fund, and I got Oxfam not to go down this route, not to go down the Médecins Sans Frontières route in Rwanda at all, and to ask the people what they wanted. So, and to see whether, in other words, these programs which are all being called psychosocial, I said, drop the word psycho. Social. Social is the framework. So Oxfam went and they got there were a bunch of adolescents, 15, 16-year-old in Bosnia, and asked them what happened in Tuzla, which was a Muslim enclave surrounded, asked them what they wanted. And a bunch of young women came forward, teenagers, and said, I'll tell you what we want. We want just a few weeks of normal life compared to our teenagers in other parts of Western Europe. Can you give us some money to put on a fashion show? Fashion show. So Oxfam swallowed hard, but in the end provided money for materials and things like that. And so they could design clothes and just have a few weeks of something else, which they did. And I was there for the opening. It was a most moving, a very striking event, these teenagers. That was in February '95. In May '95, many of those same teenagers and others, about 80 of them, it was a beautiful May evening, and they were sitting in the square there in Tuzla, and the Serbs lobbed a mortar into the middle of them and killed 8 of them straight out. So that's another matter, isn't it? That's what happens. Similar thing in Rwanda. People try to justify their work, these workers, by going out using psychological and psychiatric checklists, which have been validated on white Western populations and have no scientific validity to be used in these populations. Again, trading on this sort of universalism that you know, there's only one human response to trauma, we're all the same inside, and violent nightmare in Cambodian or in a Mozambican is the same as a violent nightmare in a Serbian. Even in those parts of the world where nightmares, the contents of nightmares and dreams have a quite different connotation for people, and indeed sometimes even a prophetic quality. Some Sri Lankan Tamils I used to, when I worked in London, I worked in London for some years for the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture. And they used to tell me about these things. Yeah, it's oh, well done. Oh, actually, the trouble is this. What is it there? What is it? Yeah, that's probably better. Just briefly, this traded on cultural trends in the West. There's no doubt that, if you like, one of the seminal trends in the 20th century has been, if you like, the decline of religion as a provider of explanatory models and the language of distress. The meaning, the language we attach to the meaning of catastrophic events. And the rise of medicine and psychology as the provider of language and frameworks to capture those things. No question. So one can just see in Britain, for example, that compared to, say, 30, 40 years ago, there are probably twice as many psychiatrists, there are 10 times as many psychologists and counsellors working every day in Britain. Dealing with so-called traumas much, much milder than this. And if you're a culture that happens to believe that bullying at school might have long-lasting effects on you, it might affect why you're depressed as a teenager or as a 25-year-old, if you believe that, then of course one must assume that people exposed to these events in Rwanda and Bosnia surely have all been damaged. All been damaged. I remember once I was talking to a Rwandan woman who had been referred up to our service there because she was traumatized, and she certainly was a very unhappy woman. She'd been mutilated by some acid or something. She'd lost her 6 children. Not dead, lost. And she sat in front of me and said, what did these people want from me? You know, what do they want? Well, I said, what helps you? She said, the only thing that helped in terms of her body was some kind of massage. She had massage. But otherwise, her predicaments were entirely pitched in terms of this violent rupture. The kids, what's happened to the kids? I'm over here. They steal in the hostel, you know, that kind of thing. By way of evidence that the war hadn't ended for her, my interpreter, as it turned out, says she was a Hutu. She was one of the minority Hutu victims. My interpreter was a Tutsi, which, you know, it comprised 8% of the victims. And after about a minute or two, she petered out and went out of the room, the patient. And eventually she didn't come back in again. And I went to find the car. She said, I'm not going to talk with that Tutsi in the room. You know? So, you know, there was a sense in which she had brought worlds with her, and one had to pay attention to that. So I eventually had to dismiss the woman, and we sort of struggled on in English. But, you know, what she felt she needed, her priorities at that time, which included Red Cross tracing for these children, of course, was completely different from the way it was being rendered up as surely a case of post-traumatic stress. Surely You know, can you imagine losing your 5 children? Can you imagine it? So we ourselves, you see, are capable of being tortured by what that would be like if it was someone close to us. And it's so easy in our culture to see that as mental pathology in that person over there. Just briefly to say, this is from a London newspaper, and it's just an interesting example. This is about casualty officers, accident emergency, receiving the victims of a nail bombing in a pub in Soho frequented by gays. And this was some homophobic psychopath who put a bomb there and killed about 6 people. What was interesting is that this article was about the impact on these trained workers. They're doing the job for which they trained, yeah? Doctors and nurses. And it was using the language of trauma again, nightmares, traumatized. These doctors and accident emergency will never be quite the same. This was a new discourse. And if you like, this in some ways was the bedrock of this explosion abroad. I mean, look, this is a profound question. What can we say in a general way about how people survive these things, how come to reconstitute? I'll give you a few questions on that in the end. Consider that I spent a long time in Central America, mostly in Nicaragua, but also in Guatemala. The Guatemalans have been subject to almost genocidal attitudes designed to eliminate what is meant to be a Mayan. Since about 1954, when with the help of the CIA, the democratically elected government, the president of Guatemala, a guy called Jacobo Arbenz, was overturned, following which about 300,000 Guatemalan civilians, peasants, were murdered by the military in a country of only about, what's the population of Guatemala? 6 million, something like that. What about this? What about this sort of impact? Think about the Mayans. The attack on the Mayans was an attack on their identity, their whole history. Their myths and identity are linked to maize. The army knew this, and would come in and burn the maize fields in front of them, knowing the particular kind of wound this inflicted on them. And the impact on survivors was to feel that some collective body, something that transcends our idea of an individual with a unique psychological space between them, transcends that. They felt that their collective body being wounded. This included the trees, the ants, and ancestors across generation. All of that had been wounded. A kind of genocide. They would say things like, "Look, feel the earth. You can see its wound. You can see its damage. Taste the water. Taste the water. It's different. It is. We are all wounded." In ways that completely cut across this way of conceiving of this so-called humanitarian way of conceiving the impact of war on an individual. Yeah? That's one thing. I'm racing around, I know. So, just 2 slides of context. This is all a bit breathless, I know. I'm 5 past. Haven't really got going yet. Context. The psychologization of things. This is, Danica will know about this. This is not war. This is a reflection. This is an article in the Lancet, a medical journal. And it says, economic crisis highlights mental health issues in India. And what this reflects is an incredible thing. I was reading the PhD examiner of a student who'd done a study of farmer suicides in India. This is not what people can do when their way of life is destroyed and they see no hope. That's something else. In the last 18 years, can you believe this? 250,000 small farmers have killed themselves using insecticide because they were lured into big business, the neoliberal world, which I think the neoliberal world is stalking this whole thing. They were lured to give up traditional crops to go into genetically modified cotton, with seeds sold by Monsanto, a big NGO, and with insecticides that had to be bought because there was no natural resistance to pests in this new engineered crop. None of this worked out. For most of them, it didn't work out. The price of cotton wasn't high enough. They have been faced ruination, not just economic ruination, but the death, if you like, a whole way of life of small subsistence farmers in India, long thousands of years of history. And for these men, mostly these men, they have taken a virtually invariable way of killing themselves, which is to take the pesticides. 250,000 of them. And what is the Indian government saying about this? They say things like, I mean, why is this called mental health issues? They're saying things like, well, clearly this is a mental health problem. These farmers all had depression. 5. Wow. These farmers all had depression. Yeah? In other words, these formulations divert people from an examination, an honest examination of the social, political, and economic worlds and context that people are living in. Divert them completely. This cannot be a good idea. Just to say, I only put this up because it's one of those bizarre claims ever to come out of an established medical body in the modern era. As a background to this, the WHO is currently saying that depression, which they don't define, but as a Western psychiatric category, assumed to be universal, is currently the most burdensome, or the number 2 most burdensome disease in the entire world of any kind of disease. My job in London is to do with HIV currently. So they are saying that depression is more burdensome than HIV disease in the world. There are 34 million cases of HIV disease at the moment in the world. 1.8 million people died of HIV in 2010. There are 8.7 million new cases of TB every year in the world. 1.4 million deaths in 2010. And even malaria has 2/3 of a million deaths per year. And so one can see how, if like this is a sort of psychological formulation gone mad, as a backdrop, and this continues to this day. I mean, this is current. Yeah. Because we don't have time, I just want to say, and I'm sure that there'll be nothing special about this, that it's hard to live an incoherent life. There's, 1 in 5 of the entire population of the world is probably, more or less destitute. These are not coherent lives. How do they survive after conflict zones or not after? One has to make coherence of it, so that the social framework and the voice of survivors seems to me to be an ethical imperative to set the scene. And too often, of course, NGOs will come in with their own agendas, and we're hearing something like that, and vying one thing and another, and one wonders what good that will do. Longer term, this is Guatemala, a longer term commemoration of war. You can trace war through. It's interesting to trace it through from the Second World War. I mean, this is Guatemala. There was just enough political space for mass exhumations of massacre sites, and some of those using forensic anthropology, a new science, the bodies were identified. You see the same thing going on that's gone on in Srebrenica in Bosnia, restored some kind of body to families. These were mass reburials with all the rites, the Mayan rites, or perhaps Christian as well. These things, people want this sort of thing. That's one thing. Interesting enough, in 1995, the 20th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, they had all sorts of commemorations here in Britain. Old British ex-servicemen who'd been in the Japanese death camps and had survived, etc., insisted that they did not want any Japanese representatives at these commemoration ceremonies, though they were quite happy to have German representatives. Why? Perhaps it's because, at least from the 60s, Germany acknowledged what it had done, it put it in the history books, it allowed German children to say to their dads, what did you do in the war? That kind of thing. And some payment of reparations, though not degrees. Not degrees. The Japanese have done none of those things. Broadly speaking, in Japanese culture, it's dishonorable to cast any doubt on the integrity of your ancestors. These things are relevant. And Japan has acknowledged none of this, and it's not in the history books, and many Japanese children don't know what Japan did in Southeast Asia, what it did in China, etc. So there are traces of that kind. And I think that the moral questions that are thrown up, I think, are something else and cannot be captured in a technical idiom of any kind. And just to finish, well, sort of not to finish, but a lot of the Bosnian refugees who came over here at that time, in line with these, what I'm describing, were directed to various mental health programs, startup mental health programs, Bosnian mental health programs around. And one man was asked, said, would you like to be a client in the Bosnian Mental Health Project in London? And he gave this answer, and I commend this answer to you. He said, we are not mad, we are betrayed. In other words, the question was asked of him as an individual victim, patient. And he recast it as a we, the collective experience of war, and he recast the word mad, a mental word, into the word betray, which is a moral word, a social moral world. Huh? What they wrestle with the moral, what is the moral meaning of a world in which these things can go on? There may be impunity for the perpetrators, and you've got to somehow live. Just the same sort of experience right now going on in Gaza in relation to the absolute impunity that Israel has to come and create a pitiless massacre and have it covered up, have it war crimes, and have there be no prospect that any of that can be brought to boot. And the very last thing, one of the profoundest things I ever read, a friend of mine was investigating truth commissions around the world, which is another way in which there may be long-term commemoration. Truth commissions. There was in Rwanda, South Africa, there was some in South America. And she, a few years ago, now 10 years ago, she went to Rwanda and she spoke to a government minister who'd lost 30 members of his own family. So this was about asking him about the Rwanda Truth Commission, about the idea truth commissions bring out it's a kind of a collective remembering, restoring people to the fabric of their times or something. And she said to him straight, a New York sociologist, tell me, is it better to remember or to forget? And he said a very profound thing. He said, we have to remember just to make sure that somehow the social and political conditions that led to the Holocaust of '94 don't come again, but we have to forget the feelings that went with that. Because since ours was a civil war, inside the country, if we don't forget the feelings, we simply cannot rebuild. And I think that's a profound point.